You are listening to Sandakan March to Oblivion, Episode 2, researched, written and narrated by Mark Felton. At Sandakan in Borneo, the Allies have the opportunity to save thousands of Australian and British POWs from a certain death at the hands of the Japanese, but they died nonetheless. In one of the greatest scandals of the Second World War, bureaucratic incompetence, national distrust, and weak leadership allowed the Japanese to commit mass murder. The truth of this terrible crime, and the Allied operation that could have prevented it from occurring, has only begun to emerge in the last 2 decades. It was far from the Allies' finest hour of the war in Asia, and a human tragedy of quite terrible proportions. It was revealed to the Australian and British public after the war that a rescue operation aimed at securing the prisoners held at Sandakan had been drawn up but never fully implemented by the Australian Army. Codenamed Operation Kingfisher, it was the brainchild of the Australian version of SOE, Special Operations Australia, SOA, which was confusingly referred to during the war as the Special Research Department, or SRD. By June 1945, SRD had accumulated a considerable amount of intelligence concerning what was happening to POWs in Borneo and elsewhere. Small parties of Australian commandos had been inserted by parachute into Borneo with the aim of disrupting the Japanese occupation and gathering intelligence. By 1945, SRD had established an extensive network of operatives and contacts in and around major towns in Borneo, including Sandakan. The Japanese requirement for forced labour in the conquered territories led to tens of thousands of surrendered Allied military personnel being sent to camps all over Asia. One concentration was on the tropical island of Borneo, which, until the Japanese attacked, had been divided into 4 separate colonies. Half the island was part of the Netherlands East Indies, with the rest split into the 3 British colonies of Sarawak, North Borneo and Brunei. The administrative capital of North Borneo was the coastal town of Sandakan, situated in the northeast of the island. Close to the town, the Japanese established 3 new prison camps to house thousands of Australian and British POWs who were shipped in from the comparative safety of Changi Camp in Singapore. Several thousand had found themselves packed tightly onto filthy and unmarked tramp steamers and sent to the steamy island of Borneo, occupied by Japan since early 1942, home to the Japanese 37th Army. Others of their comrades captured at Singapore in February 1942 were eventually shipped north to labour on the Burma-Thailand Railway. Others ended up in Japan, Taiwan or Manchuria, working in heavy industry or labouring down mines. As we heard in Episode 1, Australian Captain Lionel Matthews had founded a clandestine resistance organisation in the Sandakan Camps, but had been caught, and he and many of his comrades executed by the Japanese. Matthews had been intent on helping the Allies defeat the Japanese once they landed in Borneo, but General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander Southwest Pacific Area, or SWPA, had little interest in the POWs in Borneo. In fact, MacArthur had little interest in Borneo, period. Despite possessing extensive oil fields, the attention of SWPA was obsessively focused upon the liberation of the Philippines. Borneo only figured in American plans when MacArthur came to capture the southern Philippines after his successful landings on Luzon. This was Operation Montclair, aimed at not only the southern Philippines but also British North Borneo and large areas of the Netherlands East Indies. However, MacArthur would not commit US ground forces to the liberation of Borneo, and instead this task was turned over to the Australians, who were under his command. The Australian Special Reconnaissance Department had first parachuted small teams into Borneo in October 1943. From the get-go, the 2 objectives of the SRD operatives were to gather intelligence useful for the future invasion and organize, train and arm local resistance groups to harass the Japanese garrison of 35,000 men. The SRD units soon located the POW camps on Borneo, but they did not contact prisoners, such as Matthew's group. In fact, liberating POWs remained a secondary consideration for SRD until the end of the war. Preparing the way for the landing of Australian troops was the main objective. The physical abuse of POWs at the 3 Sandakan camps by the Japanese increased in ferocity and frequency through the rest of 1943 and into 1944, fueled in part by the knowledge that they knew that they were losing the war. In September 1944, Allied aircraft started raiding the Japanese airstrip at Sandakan. It told the Japanese that an invasion was probably imminent. After a few raids, the base was put out of commission, and the Japanese withdrew any surviving aircraft. The airstrip was eventually abandoned by the Japanese as unusable, and so this meant that they had no longer any use for the Allied prisoners languishing inside the 3 camps at Sandakan. All those Australian and British men that they had shipped to the island were now surplus to requirements. From December, the Japanese drastically reduced the POWs' already meagre rations to about 200 grams per man per day. Added to the rampant tropical diseases existing inside the camps, starvation now became a reality, and the death rate soared. In January 1945, the camp commandant, Captain Hoshijima, ordered that no further food was to be distributed to the prisoners. Instead, every grain of rice would be preserved by the Japanese, who were now cut off from supplies due to the advances made by MacArthur's army. The only food available was rice the Australian and British officers had ordered their men to store, and the prisoners now had to make do on only 85 grams of food per man per day. By February 1945, the POWs at Sandakan were staring death in the face. Without intervention, the thousands of prisoners at Sandakan would die of either starvation or disease in only a few short weeks. The trigger that caused the Japanese to begin moving the prisoners inland away from Sandakan and the coast was a series of Allied air attacks that began in early 1945. Before any invasion of Borneo could be mounted, it was desirable that all Japanese airfields in the vicinity of the landing zones be neutralized. The airstrips around Sandakan that the prisoners had laboured so hard to build were repeatedly bombed and strafed. There was also a more sinister reason for the evacuation to Ranau. It was official Japanese policy that prisoners would not be left behind to be liberated by the advancing Allies. Vice Minister Shitayama at the War Ministry in Tokyo had issued clear instructions to Japanese occupation forces across Asia on the 1st of August 1944 to, quote, prevent the prisoners of war from falling into the enemy's hands, unquote. The War Ministry had further instructed regarding POWs, quote, it is the aim not to allow the escape of a single one, to annihilate them all and not leave any traces, unquote. Sadayoshi Nakanishi, acting director of the Prisoner of War Information Bureau in Tokyo, had in his possession when captured after the war a document that reiterated these earlier orders and that stated, quote, prisoners of war must be prevented by all possible means from falling into enemy hands, unquote. It also reiterated that changing the location of POW camps ahead of the advancing Allies was necessary to preserve the prisoners as slave labour for as long as possible, but that prisoners could be released, quote, in the event of an enemy attack which leaves no alternative, unquote. This was obviously a contradictory stance, but typical of Japanese bureaucratic confusion throughout the Gulag system. It appears from the historical record that Japanese commanders were under orders to keep POWs alive for use as labour, but if faced with defeat and the liberation of those same prisoners by Allied forces, the commanders should endeavour to kill them by any means. One perfect means was a death march. At Sandakan, the Japanese determined to drive their prisoners inland 260 kilometres, knowing full well that most of them were sick with diseases and weak from starvation. The move would inevitably lead to the deaths of large numbers of POWs, thereby preventing their liberation as per government policy. The POWs' final service as slave labourers for the Japanese would be to haul tons of supplies and ammunition inland for their captors. The usefulness of POWs as labour, even towards the end of the war, is demonstrated by an extract from a Japanese government document dated the 11th of March 1945. Quote, "The location of camps will be changed as much as possible, and we shall not let prisoners of war fall into enemy hands until we have got some results from them." Unquote. The document also states that when moving prisoners, quote, "emergency measures shall be taken without delay against those of antagonistic attitudes, and we shall hope for nothing regrettable by taking proper measures to suit the occasion." Unquote. This last sentence instructed Japanese commanders to murder their prisoners, this inflammatory word being hidden inside the phrase "emergency measures." If it was the intention of the Japanese to kill the Sandakan prisoners by forcing them onto a death march, the terrain the emaciated and diseased POWs faced would make sure of it. For the first 3 miles, the prisoners had to wade through a muddy swamp teeming with mosquitoes and venomous snakes that was bisected by several creeks that had to be crossed. There then followed 40 miles of high ground, which consisted of short, very steep hills that were covered with brush and bisected by several rivers. After this had been negotiated, the prisoners faced 42 miles of serious mountain country before eventual arrival at Ranau. The Japanese decided that the POWs should march 6.5 miles a day, but most of the POWs could barely manage a mile, before collapsing in a state of dangerous exhaustion. Each group of prisoners was divided into 50-man parties. Each party was issued with a 100-pound bag of rice by the Japanese. A leader, usually an officer or senior NCO prisoner, was given a sheet of paper and told to make a roll of the prisoners in his charge. Accompanying each 50-man party was an escort group consisting of 1 Japanese officer, 3 NCOs, and 15 privates armed with rifles and fixed bayonets. The first party of prisoners to be marched out of Sandakan consisted of 455 Australians, split into 9 separate groups that left between the 29th of January and the 6th of February 1945. They were told by the Japanese that food awaited them at the new camp at Ranau, but this was a lie. Each POW carried 4 days' rations. These rations not even equating to a standard day's food for the soldiers before they were captured. The Japanese overloaded each group with rice sacks, ammunition boxes, and other military equipment, the POWs performing their last useful work for their Japanese masters before being killed off. To make matters worse, the POWs were inadequately clothed in the remains of the uniforms that they had been captured in over 3 years before, and most marched barefoot, their boots having long since disintegrated. The POWs followed a trail that had been carved through the jungle by natives. As well as the terrain and heat, the prisoners also suffered with the weather. Heavy rainstorms transformed the track into a muddy quagmire and flooded the low-lying areas. The 9 groups of Australians struggled valiantly on in an effort to reach what many believe would be sanctuary in Ranau, where the death toll was massive. Groups 1 to 5 began the trek with 265 men between them, but 70 perished on the journey. For example, Group 3 took 17 days to reach Ranau, and of the original 50 men in this group, only 37 made it. If a man fell out of the march, too exhausted or ill to continue, the Japanese guards simply shot or bayoneted him and left his body by the side of the road. In some cases, the man was abandoned and finished off later by a Japanese rearguard traversing the trail with orders to kill all stragglers. Following along behind Group 9 was the rearguard, consisting of Lieutenant Kazuo Abe and a handful of troops, with orders to dispose of any stragglers that they discovered beside the trail. The POWs were shot in the head, and then locals were ordered to bury the corpses beside the trail. When we were about a week away from Ranau, we crossed a large mountain, recalled Australian Private Keith Bottrill, and while we were making the crossing, 2 Australians, Private Humphreys and a corporal whose name I cannot remember, fell out. They were suffering from beriberi, malaria and dysentery, and could not continue any further. A Japanese private shot the corporal, and a Japanese sergeant shot Humphreys. Altogether, we lost 5 men on that hill. Faced with certain death if a man tried to resist, Bottrill was one of many who somehow found the will to keep putting one foot in front of the other. I just kept plodding along. It was dense jungle. I was heartbroken. But I thought there was safety in numbers. I just kept going. The march was accompanied by constant rifle and pistol shots from the rear as more and more men were executed. As we were going along, men would fall out as they became too weak to carry on, recalled Bottrill. We would march on and then shortly afterwards hear shots ring out and the sound of men screaming. Groups 6 to 9 marched to the village of Paganatan near Ranau, but only 138 reached their destination. Men from my party could not go on, recalled Lance Bombardier William Moxham, 2nd 15th Australian Field Regiment, marching in Group 7. Boto was the first place where we actually had to leave anyone. They remained there at this Jap dump. The next place, at the bottom of a big hill, we left 2 more men. Later we heard shots. We thought they must have been shot. Once you stopped for good. Group 7 was held at Paganatan for a month until they were ordered to resume the march to Ranau. The respite had not been accompanied by proper food and medical attention, and so a further month's starvation rations meant that the survivors were in even worse state than before. One man was puffed up with beriberi in the legs and face, recalled Moxham, and he was getting along all right on his own and could have made it, but the Japs would not let him alone, but tried to force him along. Eventually he collapsed. The Japanese guards laid into the prone Australian with their boots. A Jap turned and saw the man had gone down, and he struck him over the head with his rifle butt. The soldier was left there. The party marched on. Only 68 prisoners were still alive at this stage of the march, and on arrival at Ranau, there were 46 still standing. Completing the march to Ranau did not mean an end to suffering. When the Australian survivors struggled into the new camp, they discovered only filthy native huts. There was dirt and flies everywhere, and soon a dysentery epidemic struck the already diseased and starved prisoners. You'd wake up of a morning and you'd look to your right to see if the chap next to you was still alive, recalled Private Bottrill of this man-made hell. If he was dead, you'd just roll him over a little bit and see if he hadn't any belongings that would suit you. If not, you'd just leave him there. You'd turn on the other side and check your neighbour to see if he was dead or alive. 455 Australians had left Sandakan on the forced marches. By April 1945, only 241 of them were still alive at Ranau camp. After a month's incarceration inside Ranau, another 89 died. The Japanese forced the fittest prisoners to march to Paganatan, carrying rice for further evacuation groups from Sandakan. 21 died performing this task, in addition to all the deaths at Ranau. 455 POWs had left Sandakan. By the 26th of June 1945, that number had been reduced at Ranau camp to just 6 surviving Australians. There was still a chance, in April 1945, to have saved a significant number of Allied POWs who had remained behind at Sandakan when the first group of Australians had been marched to Ranau. Whilst the first death march was underway, starvation, disease and physical abuse killed 885 British and Australian prisoners at Sandakan. The graveyard was overflowing with corpses, and a sea of makeshift crosses surrounded the camps. In April, the Japanese decided to move the remaining POWs who were able to walk to Ranau. Tune in next time to find out the fate of the surviving prisoners and the final march to Ranau. You have been listening to Sandakan March to Oblivion, Episode 2, research written and narrated by Mark Felton. For short documentaries on a wide variety of military history subjects, visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.